The moment he raised his glass and smiled at me across that room full of people, I knew exactly what was about to happen. His eyes had that particular shine, the kind that belongs to men who have never once been held accountable for anything in their lives. My son-in-law's father, a man who had built his reputation in this city on the backs of people who trusted him, and he was about to make the biggest mistake of his comfortable, dishonest life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started, to a hospital parking lot in Thunder Bay, Ontario, on a February night so cold the air hurt your teeth, when a doctor I had never met before walked out to find me and told me that my husband was not coming home. My name is Dorothy. I was 63 years old when all of this came to a head, but the story begins when I was 31. My husband, Robert, worked in forestry management for a private logging contractor called Hargrove Timber. It was steady work in northern Ontario, the kind of work that built this country and also quietly broke the men who did it. Robert was careful. He followed every protocol, read every safety briefing, wore every piece of equipment they gave him. He used to joke that he was the only man at the camp who actually read the binders. I didn't think that was funny at the time. I thought it was just who he was. We had one daughter. Clare was 4 years old, the winter her father died. The official report said it was an equipment malfunction. A cable on a loading crane snapped during a night operation. Robert was in the wrong place. The company called it a tragic accident. They sent flowers to the funeral. They sent a representative, a junior HR person who looked barely 25, to express their condolences. And then they sent a letter from their legal department informing me that under the terms of Robert's employment contract and applicable provincial workplace legislation, his estate was entitled to a settlement of $42,000, and that accepting this settlement would constitute a full and final release of all claims. $42,000 for a 33-year-old man, for a father, for my husband. I didn't sign it right away. Something felt wrong. Not the grief. Grief made perfect sense. What felt wrong was the paperwork, the speed of it, the tidiness, the way the HR representative had looked at the floor when she spoke to me. I was not a lawyer. I was a registered nurse working part-time at the regional hospital while raising a 4-year-old. I did not have money for a lawyer. What I had was stubbornness, a library card, and a very good memory. Over the next several months, while Claire slept, I read everything I could find about workplace safety law in Ontario, about logging industry standards, about Hargrove Timber's operational history. I filed Freedom of Information requests. I wrote letters. I made phone calls that went unreturned. And slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, a picture began to emerge. The cable that had snapped was not a surprise. There had been maintenance reports flagging it. There had been a supervisor, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had signed off on continued operation despite those flags. Gerald Whitmore was not a random middle manager. Gerald Whitmore was the son-in-law of Douglas Hargrove, the man who owned the company. I found a former equipment inspector named Terry who had left Hargrove Timber 8 months before Robert died. Terry told me, over coffee at a Tim Hortons in Sudbury, that he had submitted a written report recommending that crane be taken out of service. He had been told by Gerald Whitmore to revise his assessment. When he refused, he was let go. He had kept a copy of his original report. Terry gave me a photocopy that day. I drove home with it on the passenger seat. I put it in a manila envelope. I put the envelope in the lockbox where I kept our passports and Claire's birth certificate. And then I made a decision that I have spent 30 years questioning. I did not go to a lawyer. I did not go to the media. I did not go to the Ministry of Labor. I told myself I was protecting Clare, that a long legal battle would cost us everything, that Hargrove had money and connections and we had nothing, that the settlement, as insulting as it was money I could use to keep a roof over my daughter's head. I told myself I would wait, that the right moment would come. What I really was, I think, was terrified, and exhausted, and alone in a way that I don't have adequate words for. I signed the release. I took the money, I put Terry's report in the lockbox, and I went back to work and I raised my daughter. Claire grew up knowing her father died in a workplace accident. She knew I believed the company had been negligent. She knew I had feelings about it that ran very deep, but she did not know about Terry's report. She did not know about Gerald Whitmore. I had decided, somewhere along the way, that carrying this was my burden, not hers. I worked full-time as a nurse for 30 years. I picked up extra shifts when the hospital was short. I drove Claire to skating lessons and helped with science fair projects and sat in the bleachers at track meets in the rain. We were not wealthy. We were fine. There is a version of dignity in being fine that I think only people who have worked very hard for very little truly understand. Claire was a good student. She got into the nursing program at Lakehead University, my profession, her choice, made entirely on her own, which moved me more than I told her. In her second year, she called me one evening and said she had met someone. His name was Matthew. He was in his final year of a business degree. She sounded happy in a way that was different from regular happy. I recognized it because I had felt it once, a long time ago. I met Matthew the following spring, when Claire brought him home for Easter weekend. He was polite, attentive, clearly devoted to my daughter. He helped with the dishes without being asked. He asked me thoughtful questions about my work. I liked him. His last name was Whitmore. I noticed it when Claire introduced us. Matthew Whitmore. I felt something shift in my chest, the way a floorboard shifts when there's something wrong underneath it. But Whitmore is not an uncommon name. I told myself I was being irrational. I smiled and shook his hand and asked him what part of Ontario he was from. He said, Thunder Bay. That night, after they had gone to bed, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I went to the lockbox. I did not sleep. Over the next few weeks, I did quiet research. Matthew's father was named Gerald Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore had left Hargrove Timber in the late 90s and started his own forestry consulting firm. He had done well for himself. He lived in a large house on the edge of the city. He sat on the board of 2 charitable organizations. He was, by all appearances, a respected member of the Thunder Bay business community. He was also the man who had ordered Terry to falsify a safety report. The man whose decision, whose signature had put my husband in the path of a crane with a cable that everyone knew was failing. I sat with this for a long time, months. Claire and Matthew's relationship deepened. She called me regularly, full of news about him, about their plans. I listened, I asked questions, I said the right things. I want to be honest about what I felt during this period because I think it matters. I felt a rage that was very quiet and very cold. But underneath the rage was something more complicated, something that took me a long time to name, because Matthew was not his father. Matthew was a kind young man who was clearly in love with my daughter, and Claire was happy, genuinely, visibly, completely happy. I thought about telling her. I rehearsed the conversation dozens of times, but every time I came close, I stopped. I told myself it was because I wasn't sure what it would accomplish. I told myself the evidence was old. I told myself Claire's happiness mattered more than my need for justice. What I didn't fully admit to myself was this. I was afraid that if I told her, she would choose him anyway, and I wasn't ready to find out. So I kept quiet. Again, I told myself the moment would come. Matthew proposed to Claire on a hiking trail near Sleeping Giant Provincial Park. She called me from the parking lot, voice shaking, and I told her I was so happy for her, and I was. That part was real. The happiness for her was real. The wedding was planned for the following September, 160 guests at a venue outside the city. Claire asked me to help with the planning, and I did flowers, catering, the small details that fill the months before a wedding. I met Gerald Whitmore for the first time at the engagement dinner. He was exactly as I had imagined him. Broad-shouldered, well-dressed, accustomed to filling a room. He shook my hand and called me Dorothy, and said that Claire was a wonderful young woman and that Matthew was a lucky man. I said thank you. I watched his face for any sign of recognition. There was none. I was just the bride's mother. A nurse from Sudbury. No one of consequence. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. In the months before the wedding, I made some calls. I tracked down Terry. He was retired now, living outside Sault Ste. Marie, still sharp, still angry about what had happened. He remembered me. He still had documents. He was, it turned out, very willing to talk. I also contacted a journalist named Priya who covered labor and workplace safety for a regional publication. I had read her work for years. She was thorough and careful, and she did not let things go. We had coffee in a Tim Hortons. I seemed to have a lot of important conversations in Tim Hortons, and I told her everything. I showed her what I had. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. She said she had been looking into Hargrove Timber's safety record for a different story. She said what I had given her was significant. I asked her to wait until after the wedding. She agreed. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Clare 2 weeks before the wedding, because it changed things. She came to stay with me for a long weekend to finalize some details, and on the Saturday evening we were sitting on the back porch with tea, and she asked me, out of nowhere, whether I was truly all right with everything. I asked her what she meant. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she knew. She had known for almost a year. She had been doing research on Matthew's family out of curiosity at first, then out of a growing unease, and she had found things. Old records. An inspector's name. Her father's accident. She had put it together. I couldn't speak for a moment. She said she hadn't told me because she didn't know how. She said she had told Matthew. Matthew had confronted his father. Gerald had dismissed it, said it was old news, said the settlement had been legal, said there was nothing to answer for. Matthew had been devastated. He had offered to call off the wedding. Clare had told him she needed time to think. She looked at me with eyes that I recognized because they were my eyes, and she said, "I still want to marry him, Mum. He's not his father, but I didn't know how to tell you, and I am so sorry that I kept this from you." I put down my tea. I looked at my daughter, this person I had driven to skating lessons and sat in bleachers for in the rain, this person who was the whole point of every extra shift I had ever worked, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. I felt relieved. That she knew, that she had been carrying it too, that I had not been alone in this for quite as long as I thought. I told her I understood. I told her I was not angry at her. I told her about Priya and about Terry and about what I had been planning. She listened. When I finished, she said, "Do what you need to do, Mum. Whatever you need to do." The wedding was beautiful. Clare was radiant in a way that made my chest ache. Matthew cried when she walked down the aisle. I sat in the front row, where the mother of the bride belongs, and I held myself together because my daughter needed me to, and because I am very good at holding myself together when it matters. The reception was at a venue with tall windows overlooking the water. There were speeches after dinner. Gerald Whitmore was scheduled to speak third, after the best man and before the maid of honor. He stood up with his glass of wine and his easy confidence, and he began to talk about his son and what a fine young man Matthew had grown into, and how proud he was. And then he looked at me. He made a joke, a smile on his face, the room full of people who didn't know any better. He said something about how Matthew had done well to find a girl with such a practical upbringing that it was clear Clare got her resilience from having to make do without certain advantages. He said it pleasantly. He said it the way men like him say things, with a smile that gives them deniability. The people around him gave uncertain laughs. My daughter's face went still. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that. I have worked in emergency rooms. I know what composure under pressure looks like. I said, "I'd like to say a few words, if you don't mind." I said that I had been looking forward to this evening for a long time, that I had been waiting, in fact, for the right moment to say what I was about to say. I said that in February of 1994, my husband Robert died at a Hargrove timber work site in northern Ontario when a crane cable failed. I said that the cable had been flagged in a maintenance report submitted by a certified equipment inspector named Terry, and that the recommendation to take the crane out of service had been overridden and suppressed by a site supervisor named Gerald Whitmore, whose signature appeared on the documentation authorizing continued operation. The room was very quiet. I said that I had spent 30 years with a copy of that original report in a lockbox, that a journalist named Priya had spent the last several months verifying and expanding on what I had, and that her story would be published the following week. That I was sharing this tonight not to ruin a wedding, but because Gerald Whitmore had just made a joke about my daughter's upbringing, and I thought that before he finished his speech, the room deserved to know exactly who was making it. I sat down. I looked at Clare. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It took me a moment to identify it. It was pride. Gerald Whitmore did not finish his speech. He sat down. His wife did not look at him. Matthew reached across the table and took Clare's hand. Several guests who had known Robert, old family friends, former colleagues of his who had made the drive, were on their feet. I will not tell you the evening was without pain. It was not. There are no clean moments in situations like this. There was a difficult hour, later, in a side room, with Gerald and his lawyer on the phone and Matthew sitting very still, and Claire holding my hand. There was a conversation that was hard and long and necessary. Priya's story ran the following Thursday. The Ministry of Labor announced a review of the original incident file within 2 weeks. Terry gave a formal statement. It did not bring Robert back. Nothing was ever going to bring Robert back. But here is what I want to tell you, and I want you to hear it clearly, especially if you are carrying something heavy that you have been carrying alone for a very long time. Gerald Whitmore called me 3 months after the wedding. His lawyer had advised him not to. He called anyway. He said he was sorry. He did not say it well. Men like him rarely do. The language of genuine accountability sits awkwardly on them. But he said it. He said that he had known at the time that he was making the wrong call, that he had been young and afraid and trying to protect himself and his father-in-law's company, that he had told himself for 30 years that the settlement made it square. I told him the settlement did not make it square. I told him that $42,000 was what he had decided my husband's life was worth, and that Claire and I had built something good in spite of that, not because of it. I told him I was not going to tell him I forgave him. Not that day, maybe not ever, but that I was done carrying what belonged to him. I hung up and I sat for a while in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had sat up all night 30 years ago with the lockbox open on the table, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the weight of the thing had shifted. Not disappeared, shifted. Moved from a place inside me to a place outside, where it could be looked at properly, where other people could see it too, where it was no longer mine alone to hold. Claire called that evening. She and Matthew were doing well. She was 3 months pregnant. She said she had been thinking about what to name the baby, and that if it was a boy, she wanted to name him Robert. I told her that was a good name. I told her it was a very good name.